There is a man who fought 14 military campaigns across 30 years and never lost a single one. A man who took a small Christian highland kingdom surrounded by enemies on every side and turned it into the dominant power of the entire Horn of Africa. A man whose armies marched across terrain so difficult that his enemies repeatedly assumed he could not reach them, and who repeatedly proved them wrong. His name was Amda Seyon. He is almost completely unknown outside Ethiopia. This is an extraordinary omission. By any objective military and political measure, Amda Seyon belongs in the conversation with the great medieval conquerors, not as a footnote to their stories but as a figure of comparable achievement who simply happened to operate in a part of the world that Western historical scholarship spent centuries ignoring. He took the throne at a moment of genuine crisis. By the time he died 30 years later, Ethiopia had expanded to nearly triple its previous size. Every enemy that had threatened him was either conquered, pacified, or paying tribute. Not one of his military campaigns ended in defeat. This is his story. 14 campaigns. 30 years. 0 defeats. A kingdom that became an empire. A man who should be as famous as any warrior king in history, and isn't. Not because he didn't earn it. Because the world wasn't paying attention to the right part of the map. It is long overdue. The Ethiopia Amda Seyon inherited in 1314 was not the vast empire he would leave behind. It was a Christian highland kingdom of the Solomonic dynasty, restored to power only 40 years earlier, that controlled the central Ethiopian plateau and a surrounding zone of vassal territories. It was hemmed in on almost every side. To the east, along the trade routes connecting the Ethiopian interior to the Red Sea coast, a series of Muslim sultanates had grown wealthy and powerful. The most significant was the Sultanate of Ifat, which controlled key trade routes and had ambitions that brought it into direct conflict with the Solomonic state. Ethiopia's Christianity was ancient. The kingdom of Aksum had converted in the 4th century, making it one of the earliest Christian states in the world. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church was a central institution, its monasteries wealthy, its clergy literate and influential, its hold on royal legitimacy profound. The Solomonic dynasty traced its authority to the union of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, a founding myth that was not merely legend but the constitutional basis of royal power. Amda Seyon inherited all of this, the legitimacy, the church, the power, and the enemies pressing against every border. The conflict between the Ethiopian highlands and the Muslim lowland sultanates was not new when Amda Seyon took the throne. But previous Ethiopian rulers had raided and retreated, content to strike and withdraw to their highland strongholds. Amda Seyon looked at the same situation and made a different calculation. He was not going to raid the edges of enemy territory and go home. He was going to conquer. And he was going to start immediately. Before he ever led an army into the field, Amda Seyon faced a crisis of a different kind. He had taken multiple wives in a manner the Ethiopian Orthodox Church found unacceptable, including, apparently, a woman related to him by blood. The Church considered it incestuous and a profound religious violation. The most prominent religious figures of the period, including the abbot of the great monastery of Debra Libanos, publicly condemned him and refused to offer him communion. In a kingdom where royal authority rested on Christian divine sanction, this was a genuine political threat. The monks did not stay quiet. The abbot Johannes of Debra Libanos publicly condemned the emperor and denied him the religious legitimation that Ethiopian rulers depended on. This was not merely personal censure. It was a constitutional challenge. Amda Seyon's response revealed his character. He did not capitulate entirely, but he did not attempt to crush the opposition either. He navigated the crisis through partial accommodation, strategic patience, and the demonstration of military effectiveness. He understood something the monks perhaps did not fully calculate: an emperor who wins wars is very hard to delegitimize. He proceeded to win wars. And as each campaign succeeded, the religious controversy gradually receded as a political threat. The church that had condemned him for his marriages found itself the primary beneficiary of the territories he was conquering. New lands meant new populations to convert, new parishes, new monasteries. The scandal that should have ended his reign before it began became instead the first test of what he was made of. He passed it. He always passed it. The Muslim sultanates to the east had been a source of friction for generations. The trade routes connecting the Ethiopian interior to the Red Sea coast, through which Ethiopian gold, ivory, and highland goods moved, passed through their territory. They taxed Ethiopian trade, diverted revenue, and posed a constant strategic threat to the highland kingdom's economic lifeline. Amda Seyon's approach was direct. He campaigned east with a scale and depth of penetration that his predecessors had never attempted. He was not raiding. He was conquering. The Sultan of Ifat, Hak ad-Din I, was defeated and killed in one of the early campaigns. This was not a negotiated settlement or a tributary arrangement. This was the elimination of a ruling dynasty and its replacement with Ethiopian dominance. By the early 1320s, Amda Seyon had transformed the eastern frontier from a zone of contested influence into a zone of Ethiopian hegemony. An extraordinary achievement accomplished in just a few years, and it was only the beginning. The message sent to every other sultanate in the region was unmistakable. The Ethiopian highlands were not content to defend. They intended to dominate. Every route, every trade network, every caravan that had moved through lowland Muslim territory paying Muslim taxes was now moving through territory that acknowledged Ethiopian authority. The revenue shifted. The strategic balance shifted. Amda Seyon had changed the fundamental equation of power in the Horn of Africa in a single campaign season. He would spend the next 20 years making it permanent. Military power alone does not sustain an empire. Amda Seyon understood that the expansion of Ethiopian territory required an ideological framework that could explain and justify it. The Kebra Nagast, the glory of kings, was finalized and given royal endorsement during his reign. The text established, in elaborate and theologically sophisticated form, that the Solomonic emperors of Ethiopia were the rightful heirs of the biblical covenant, that the Ark of the Covenant itself had been brought to Ethiopia by Menelik, son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Ethiopian expansion was not conquest. It was the natural extension of divine order. This was a profound ideological claim. It gave Amda Seyon's wars against Muslim sultanates the character of holy warfare, the defense and extension of the covenant people. It provided the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which had been his institutional adversary, with a framework in which supporting his campaigns was itself a religious obligation. The Kebra Nagast circulated beyond Ethiopia. Copies reached Egypt, where it functioned as a diplomatic document projecting Ethiopian Christian legitimacy to the wider world. He understood that empire required a story, and he made sure his empire had the most powerful story available. The warriors who marched under Amda Seyon's banners were not merely soldiers. They were the fighting arm of a covenant people defending and extending God's kingdom on earth. That belief, reinforced by the Kebra Nagast, by the blessing of priests, by the crosses carried into battle, was a military asset as real as any sword or shield. Amda Seyon had weaponized his ideology as effectively as he had weaponized his army. The two worked together. They always do for the great conquerors. The campaign of 1329 was the military centerpiece of Amda Seyon's reign, a coordinated offensive against multiple Muslim sultanates simultaneously, recorded in an Ethiopian military chronicle that is among the most detailed accounts of medieval African warfare to have survived. What the chronicle describes is not a single army moving along a single line of advance but multiple Ethiopian forces operating in coordination across a wide area, each targeting different objectives while collectively achieving the strategic goal of breaking the military power of the eastern and southern sultanates. The sultanates targeted included Dawaro, Hadiyya, Sharqa, and Bali, states that had not previously been brought under sustained Ethiopian pressure and had apparently concluded that Amda Seyon's earlier campaigns had reached their natural limits. They were wrong. His army moved through the lowland territories with a speed his enemies had not anticipated, highland warriors descending through passes they knew, achieving repeated tactical surprise against forces that had expected more time to prepare. Sultanate after sultanate was defeated. By the end of the campaign season, every target had been achieved. By the end of the 1329 campaign, Amda Seyon had achieved a degree of regional dominance that no Ethiopian ruler had previously attained. The Horn of Africa had a new master. He had done it without losing a single major engagement. His enemies had assumed the terrain, the distances, and the logistics would stop him. Nothing stopped him. He moved faster, struck harder, and sustained the campaign longer than anyone believed was possible. The Great Campaign of 1329 was the moment Amda Seyon stopped being a regional power and became an empire. The chronicle of Amda Seyon's campaigns gives us something rare in medieval African history, enough detail to analyze how he actually fought. The Ethiopian army of this period was a combined arms force. Its core was infantry equipped with round-hide shields, throwing spears for opening engagements, and swords for close combat. Ethiopian highland warriors were conditioned by altitude, men who trained and lived at elevations that left lowland opponents gasping were fighting at their natural pace while their enemies struggled with oxygen debt on every descent from the plateau. He also maintained cavalry, used effectively where the broken highland terrain permitted, on the broader lowland plains where their speed and shock could be decisive. What made his campaigning distinctive was not any single tactical innovation but the combination of strategic ambition and operational execution. He consistently aimed for objectives deeper into enemy territory than his opponents expected him capable of reaching. He moved faster than logistical assumptions of the period suggested was possible. And he maintained aggression through conditions that would have caused more cautious commanders to pause. He led from the front. The chronicles describe him personally present in engagements, visible to his troops, fighting rather than merely commanding. In the military cultures of the medieval world, personal courage in battle was not separable from leadership authority. A king who would not fight was a king whose legitimacy was permanently in question. Amda Seyon left no such question open. His men followed him into terrain and distances that tested the limits of what a medieval army could sustain. They followed because he led the way personally. Always. Conquest is not the same as pacification. The eastern and southern regions of Amda Seyon's expanding empire were not populated by people who accepted Ethiopian Christian dominance without ongoing resistance. Ifat in particular proved resilient, defeated repeatedly, its ruling Walaasma dynasty survived each defeat and reorganized, drawing on the religious solidarity of Islam as a framework for resistance to highland Christian expansion. The sons of defeated sultans continued to contest Ethiopian authority through open revolt, withheld tribute, and connections with Muslim powers outside Ethiopia. Amda Seyon's response to each rebellion followed a consistent pattern. He did not attempt to rule the lowland territories directly, the distances were too great and the populations too different for that to be sustainable. Instead he demanded tribute, nominal submission of local rulers, and the cessation of activities that threatened Ethiopian trade routes or highland security. When these demands were violated, he campaigned again. This was empire building on the medieval African model, a system of overlordship maintained by the credible threat of overwhelming force and the memory of what happened to those who tested it. For 30 years, every time the system broke down, Amda Seyon fixed it. Personally. In the field. With an army he led himself. No rebellion outlasted him. No sultanate successfully defied him twice without being crushed a second time. The enemies who counted on exhaustion to save them miscalculated the most fundamental fact about the man they were dealing with. He did not get tired. He did not stop. For 30 years he was always willing and always able. And when he died, the empire he had maintained by sheer personal force began immediately to face the consequences of his absence. The military campaigns of Amda Seyon's reign were not conducted in an economic vacuum. One of the primary drivers of the conflict between the Ethiopian highlands and the Muslim lowland sultanates was control of trade, specifically the enormously valuable routes connecting the Ethiopian interior to the Red Sea coast and through it to the wider Indian Ocean commercial world. Ethiopia exported goods the medieval world wanted badly: gold from highland mines, ivory from lowland elephant populations, civet musk, hides, incense, and exotic animals. These exports moved east and met merchants from Arabia and India who paid in silver, cotton textiles, and luxury goods. Control of the routes along which these goods traveled was control of the revenue that funded everything: the army, the church, the royal household, the patronage networks that sustained political loyalty. When Amda Seyon campaigned against the eastern sultanates, he was not merely expanding territory. He was securing revenue. Every sultanate that submitted was a sultanate that could no longer tax Ethiopian trade caravans. The wealth that flowed through secured routes funded subsequent campaigns. The campaigns secured additional routes. The cycle was self-reinforcing, and Amda Seyon rode it with the strategic intelligence of a ruler who understood that military and economic power were aspects of a single system. The revenues Amda Seyon secured made Ethiopia wealthy in a way it had not been since the height of the Aksumite Empire centuries before. The church received a portion of this wealth: new monasteries, new parishes, new illuminated manuscripts. The army received the rest: better equipment, more consistent pay, the ability to campaign at the distances and durations that his ambitions required. He had built a machine that fed itself. Conquest generated revenue. Revenue funded conquest. And at the center of the machine, controlling its direction and its pace, was one man who never lost. The relationship between Amda Seyon and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church was one of the defining tensions of his reign, and one of its most interesting features, because neither side ever fully won and neither side ever fully lost. The church had condemned him at the beginning over his marriage practices. He had not capitulated but had not destroyed the church's position either. As his campaigns succeeded and his empire grew, the relationship shifted. An emperor manifestly extending the reach of Ethiopian Christianity into territories previously dominated by Islam was difficult to characterize as an enemy of the faith. The great monasteries of Ethiopia, Debre Libanos above all, became important partners in administering the expanding empire. The church provided literate administrators, record keepers, judges, and the ideological framework that made governance of distant territories possible. In return, Amda Seyon's campaigns created opportunities for the church: new territories meant new populations to convert, new monasteries, new sources of income. The church that had condemned him for his marriages eventually found itself the primary institutional beneficiary of the expansion those marriages had not stopped him from achieving. This was not hypocrisy on either side. It was the pragmatic adjustment of two powerful institutions to the reality that they needed each other. The emperor and the church circled each other warily throughout his reign and emerged at his death in a working relationship that had survived despite everything. The church remembered his scandalous marriages. He remembered their condemnation. Both remembered what they had built together. History, with its usual economy, remembers the empire and forgets the arguments. The arguments were real. So was the empire. Amda Seyon's Ethiopia was not isolated from the wider medieval world. The Horn of Africa was connected by trade, religion, and politics to Egypt, to Arabia, and to the Indian Ocean trading network. Egypt in this period was ruled by the Mamluk Sultanate, a powerful Islamic military state that considered itself the patron of Islam throughout the Middle East and East Africa. The Mamluks were deeply interested in what was happening in Ethiopia, because the treatment of Muslim populations within the expanding Ethiopian Empire was a matter of ongoing diplomatic sensitivity. When Amda Seyon's campaigns resulted in the subordination of Muslim sultanates, complaints reached the Mamluk court. The Sultan of Egypt periodically threatened retaliation, including threats to mistreat the large Coptic Christian community in Egypt in response to the treatment of Muslims in Ethiopia. These were serious threats. Amda Seyon could not ignore the possibility that aggressive campaigning in the East would provoke retaliation against Egyptian Christians. He navigated this external pressure the same way he navigated everything else, with firmness and pragmatism. He did not stop campaigning. He did maintain diplomatic channels and correspond with the Mamluk court. He avoided the systematic religious persecution of his Muslim subjects that would have made the Egyptian threats politically unavoidable to act on. He was fighting Islamic states on his frontiers while protecting Islamic communities within his borders, a distinction that the Mamluks could accept even as they protested the frontier campaigns. He understood that his empire had an international dimension. He managed it. He never let it stop him. Managing constraints while pursuing objectives is the mark of the truly great commanders, and Amda Seyon was that by any measure. When Amda Seyon died in 1344, after 30 years on the throne, the Ethiopia he left behind was almost unrecognizable. The Solomonic state that had controlled a compact highland territory in 1314 had become the dominant power of the entire Horn of Africa. The territories now under Ethiopian hegemony stretched from the Red Sea coast in the northeast to territories south of the Ethiopian plateau that had never previously been incorporated into any Ethiopian polity. The kingdom had roughly tripled in its reach. 14 campaigns. No defeats. An empire from a kingdom. The military record was, by any standard, extraordinary. The emperors who followed would struggle, and frequently fail, to maintain the territorial extent he had achieved, because that achievement required exactly his combination of military genius, strategic patience, and personal authority in the field. None of his immediate successors possessed all three in his measure. But the framework he established, the empire structured around the Solomonic dynasty, the Christian highland core, the subordinated Muslim periphery, the secured trade routes, persisted as the template for Ethiopian political ambition for centuries. Haile Selassie, who ruled Ethiopia until 1974, traced his legitimacy to the same Solomonic line that Amda Seyon represented. The Kebra Nagast that had been endorsed during Amda Seyon's reign remained the constitutional foundation of Ethiopian royal identity for 7 centuries. The state Amda Seyon built shaped Ethiopian history from 1314 until the 20th century. The trade routes he secured became the arteries of Ethiopian commerce for generations. The church he managed remained the central institution of Ethiopian society. He built things that lasted. That is the final measure of a great ruler. Amda Seyon I belongs in the conversation about the great medieval military commanders. Not as a curiosity or a regional footnote. As a primary figure. 14 campaigns. 30 years. Not one defeat. A kingdom tripled in size. A trade network secured. A dynasty legitimized by a text that would sustain Ethiopian royal ideology for 7 centuries. By comparison, Edward III of England, celebrated as one of the great medieval warrior kings, fought for decades and won famous battles. He also suffered reversals, lost ground, and presided over a conflict that was genuinely indecisive for most of his reign. Amda Seyon's record is cleaner. His strategic achievement is arguably greater. He is a fraction as famous. The reason for his obscurity is not complicated. For most of the period in which the historical canon was being formed, African history was not considered worth serious study by the European and American institutions that decided what mattered. Ethiopia had its own rich written tradition, but it was in Puizi, an ancient Ethiopian language that very few outside Ethiopia could read. The scholars who might have brought Amda Seyon to international attention were not reading his chronicles. That has changed. A growing body of scholarship has recovered him with the rigor he deserves. He is not completely unknown. But he should be famous. The man who never lost a war, who built an empire from a kingdom under siege, who navigated religious controversy, external diplomatic pressure, and the perpetual instability of a frontier empire without ever breaking, he deserves the same recognition that the military giants of Europe and Asia receive as a matter of course. He fought 14 wars. He won 14 wars. The empire he built lasted 700 years. That is not a regional story. That is history. And it is long overdue.